Okay, I am having a
Right?
wonderful conversation with two brothers and their dad. These are the Schmitzes family, and the weird and wonderful thing we are going to talk about, and not only about how this whole thing worked, but also about their CD release, the 2016 on Ravello. Wonderful. Ace Composers, 21st Century Chamber Music. It's an incredible CD. Wonderful, wonderful music. Congratulations to all three. You're all brilliant. Really, really, really wonderful, wonderful music. I hope, I do have an audience out there that are musicians and faculty members. This stuff should be performed much, much more, I'm sure. But so let me try and identify everybody. It's hard for me to quite know where we're going to come out at the end of this in terms of who's where and what. So I'm just going to speak something about how do I do this in seniority. I'm introducing now. Wave at me. That'll be most discreet. I would like to introduce Eric Schmidt. There he is. There's Eric Schmitz. Alan Schmitz, who is the father of these two, and Christopher Schmitz. There he is. Okay, so now everybody keep track because that's the last time I'm going to be able to keep on top of it. And we're talking about we're going to talk about the CD, but much, much more than that. It's so interesting. A father who is a composer and two sons who are composers. How is that about? I don't know, elder abuse or something. I don't know, elder influence, something. But it's fast. It has to be a fascinating story. Uh, on this CD, again, composers, 21st century chamber music, these three composers, three pieces. Very discreet of you to not have to fight over. Each of you gets three pieces. I like that, but I'm going to ask about other things later. We're talking Christopher Schmidt's five miniatures for alto saxophone, marimba, and vibraphone. Superb. Rhapsody for violin and piano. Pay attention, everybody. Take notes because here's the repertoire. Fabulous repertoire. Again, Christopher Schmidt's The Playful Lark for flute and piano. It's a delight. Delicious. Alan, father, oldest, the man responsible for this whole thing. I have a funny feeling. His brass trio for trumpet, horn, and trombone. Hexachord Fantasy for flute, clarinet, violin, cello, piano, and percussion. That's a beauty. What a beautiful, amazing piece. And Tango Fantasy for viola and guitar. What a combination. And Eric, reflections for what I love about your choices, Eric, is the exact, I don't know, you know what I'm trying to say, something about the color, the exact colors of these instruments. They're all in the same range. You know what I'm saying? And people sometimes don't think maybe that they can work because they're too much the same. If you get my drift. Anyway, reflections for English horn, electric guitar. That's very, very interesting. Bass and drums, very interesting piece. The trio, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous for flugelhorn. This is what I mean. Flugelhorn, English horn, and cello. That mellow mid range coloration tempered by these three different instruments. Superb. And big changes ahead for tenor and bass trombone. How is that? Everybody out there in the trombone profession, here we got one for two trombones, tenor and bass trombone. In this case, the trombone is playing both parts. It's a wonderful piece. Who did I miss? Did I get everybody? Come
I
on,
think
wake
that's
up.
it.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, good. Anyway, those are the works on this program. A diverse CD of wonderful, wonderful music and wonderful, fascinating, interesting combinations of instruments that really professionals in the industry should really have a look at and pay attention to. Phew. Now a quick one about who everybody is, and then I'll let you guys have a say. Sorry to be so long in introductions. Christopher Schmitz, Associate Professor of Music Theory at the Townsend School of Music, Mercer University. Which campus is that? In Macon? That's the campus in Macon.
That's to make
Yeah. Doctor from the University of Texas, Austin. Alan Schmitz, retired professor of theory and composition at the School of Music, University of Northern Iowa. 23 years. That's called tenure. Congratulations. PhD from Rutgers. Eric Schmidt, Associate Professor of Jazz Studies, and catch me if I'm missing anything or my information is old, but Associate Professor of Jazz Studies, Music Theory at SUNY Oswego, State University in New York at Oswego. And in 2019, I don't know whether to congratulate you or send you, flowers of mourning, but acting department chair at the department. Of course, you're going to have a great time, but the responsibilities are big, I'm sure. Anyway, congratulations. Those are the three people we're going to be chatting at, and I've got a couple questions. Let's just get started so I can shut up here. Tell me about this CD's dedication to Judith Lee Welch Guerin. Who was she? Who wants to go? Chris, maybe? Or Alan? Who wants to pick it up? Chris?
Sorry, I missed about half the question, but I heard Judith Lee Welch Guerin, and that was our beloved grandmother on my mother's side, and she passed away shortly before we released the CD, so we wanted to dedicate that CD to her memory.
Wonderful. And yes, there's a little breakup, but it's fine. We're doing fine. I just wanted to know because it's important, and now that I realize it's part of the family, this woman was your grandmother on your mother's side. Did get that right?
That's right. Yeah, my wife's mother.
Uh-huh. Was she very supportive? She must have been wonderful. Let's just talk just a couple minutes about her.
Well, I'll talk. This is Alan. So Judith was born in 1926 and I think died in 2015. She's pianist. She graduated from the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music back in the day, in the late 40s. I think in 1948, I believe she graduated from there and went on to playing and teaching, but rather briefly. She took a job in Marshall, Texas, right out of conservatory, and was teaching there. And that's when she met my father-in-law. And so then she didn't continue teaching, but she didn't continue teaching at the university there in Marshall, Texas, but left that position so to be with him. And he was in the petroleum industry, geologist, and they, started their family, which I'm glad about. So
sure, you know what? That's exactly the story that we all have, all of our families. My mother could have gone in a certain direction, went in another direction because of just things, and also just raising a family, all that stuff. So it's just part of the history of who we are, especially in that time in probably the 40s and 50s.
Right, yeah, and in the years that my wife and I grew up, we were both born in 1950, my wife and I, and met at university when we were music students in New Mexico, University of New Mexico. So she continued doing some playing and taught. She had a studio at home, and so she had many successful students who've gone on, I'm sure.
Would she be considered? Would she be considered in your family? I'm speaking to all of you, Eric and Chris. Is she somehow there in terms of that? You know what I mean? That backstory that somehow got you into music or not? It doesn't matter. I'm just curious because there she was with a possible career in music and did the family. You know what I mean? She was a pianist. Eric, how about it?
Sure. We did visit, when we were growing up, we would go and visit them. We lived in southern Colorado for about 5 years, so we weren't that far from New Mexico where they lived at the time. And we would always see the piano. They had this, I guess, a spinet piano in the den, and there was always music on the stand, and we'd come in, and even if we weren't actively playing music at the time, it was always part of the atmosphere. So we were aware that she had taught her private students for many years. Also, our mother, Dana Schmitz, was a professional flutist and pianist for many years, and she's since, I think, retired as well, since my folks moved down to Houston. But I'd like to just emphasize not only the multi-generational aspect of having musicians in the family, but it was really a house full of music. And uh, whether or not we ended up talking specifically about composition, which I can't recall that we did when I was growing up. Um, but some of my earliest memories of watching my dad were him sitting at the table with his ruler and maybe a credit card to make a straight line on the manuscript paper. And he was writing a score. You know, that was a memory that was just kind of a, maybe not a daily occurrence, but it happened frequently enough that that was part of the atmosphere. So he would play guitar. That's his main instrument. He would play classical guitar regularly, and we would hear that. We would hear my mother playing piano or playing flute, and the house was literally just full of music. So that sort of environment was so rich in, I think, all of our developments, and subsequently just the idea that we could become musicians professionally. I don't know how Chris thinks about this, but I never even questioned it. It just never crossed my mind that we couldn't. And I think all of us, there are 4 kids in the family. We have a younger brother and sister as well, who are both very fine musicians. Younger sister plays professionally in Houston. She's a wonderful violinist. That's Emily. And our younger brother, Lee, who lives in France, is a fantastic pianist. So just that family atmosphere of music happening constantly. Somebody was always practicing, whether it was mother or father or, you know, one of the siblings. And it sometimes got annoying because we had to share a music room. So if somebody was playing the piano and if Chris wanted to practice his trombone, he had to go into the bedroom. But all in all, it was just an amazing environment in which to grow. So I think we all have to acknowledge this debt that we owe to our parents. And then going back to Judith Guerin, who is our grandmother, we can clearly see that that actually started at least in the generation prior. So that's just part of our personal family legacy that I think is so important.
Chris, or Eric, excuse me, let me just jump in for a second. Can I ask you to move Eric just a little bit, and let me see which direction. I want to make sure you're in frame. If you could move there, that's better. I just want to be safe, because when this is all over, it's amazing how many people are decapitated about halfway through their face, and I don't want that. I want this to work. By the way, thank you for that beautiful history, because I'll speak a little slowly. I can hear some clatter going on. But because it speaks immediately to, of course, what this family is. I suspected it. I wanted to ask about it. But you can imagine how green with envy most of us are, who are even professional musicians. I mean, my family was not really very musical. I think most people might be more or less in that environment, but to those that I interview that live in this magical world that's just full of music and music making and composition, it's just absolutely stunning. So congratulations as a family. Yes, Alan, you wanted to say something?
No.
See, fathers, you know, they're just so, Okay, what I want to ask now is, and I'm being facetious a tiny, teeny bit. I'm trying to get some conversation, but I know, and I ask this all the time, it's always, you know, how do you sit down and decide what's going to be where, who's going to play, who's going to do what? I'm sure you had limits in terms of instrumentation and so on and budget, but how did that work out? Who wants to jump in? Alan, you look like you're waiting to say something.
Oh, okay. You're talking about the pieces that are on this CD.
Yeah, what kind of a fight did you all get into in order to come to grips with who went where? That's the joke of it.
Well, okay. I don't recall a fight. We did have limits in terms of how much time.
Sure.
And so, you know, it's kind of interesting. This project just went very nicely, very well. The Parma record company, those people were just wonderful about this because we had access to performers. So we were writing for specific performers. So the people who played our music, in my case, since I was on the faculty at the University of Northern Iowa, those players, like the brass trio, that's, those are three professors at the University of Northern Iowa. Okay. And then the piece for viola and guitar, the Tango Fantasy, then the violist was in the office right next door, as a matter of fact, Julia Bullard. And then the guitarist is a close friend of mine, Todd Seeley, who has already pretty well established with a number of recordings. It turns out that his wife is on the faculty at the university where I was. And so we've been close friends for many, many years. And he graciously made I did a whole CD of guitar music since I'm guitarist, but Todd really knows how to play. So much better. So there's a CD called Lyric Images that's also released by Parma that he did so some years before. Anyway, that's what happened. And I think we can hear from the others. Christopher and Eric both have colleagues or friends. I think from Eastman, Eric's connection with Eastman. But let me stop.
Where do you want to start? By the way, thanks, Alan, for taking command of the interview. I love that. Who wants to start? Chris? Let's do Chris next because that's exactly right. Let's talk about your colleagues who played in each of these pieces that are on this CD. So thank you, Alan. Chris.
Okay, yeah. It's a similar situation for me. Again, those were my colleagues at Mercer University in the School of Music there, and I was fairly new to the faculty when we made those recordings. So we were preparing a recital of my music, and decided to use the music from that recital, some of that music, to include on the CD. And that's basically where that came from. Amy Schwartz-Moretti, fantastic violin players on the faculty at Mercer, and agreed to play my violin piece. And Elizabeth Pridgeon, piano faculty, Monty Cole, Marcus Reddick, and Kelly Via. We're all just it was great to have their support to make those recordings, and we did all the recording ourselves on campus. Steve Moretti helped us to do the production, and so we were able to get a pretty close to finished, polished product by the time we turned it over to Palmer Records, and they just kind of put the final touches on it, as far as mastering and so forth.
Eric?
Okay, I guess I'll start with somebody who's from a little bit closer to where you are, and that's Michael Davis, who's a world-class trombonist, and he's actually originally from San Jose. But I actually met him when I was about 16 years old, and I was taking part in a high school jazz camp up in Fairbanks, Alaska, where we lived in Anchorage for 8 years. But he was... at the time, I believe he was the solo trombonist with Frank Sinatra, and he came and did some clinics and played a performance, and it was just really amazing. So I got to speak with him just a little bit, and fast forward 20 years later, I was able to invite him to my college to work with my students, and then I kept in touch with him over the last couple years, and he was gracious enough to record a piece. And the piece, Big Changes Ahead, was actually the trombone quartet version, was written specifically for him. It's an adaptation of a big band piece that I had composed before that. And he's, among other things, he toured with the Rolling Stones for decades, and he's just astonishing. So I was absolutely thrilled to have him do that piece. The other two pieces, one of them was written actually originally for the flugelhornist Brian Shaw, who I met at Eastman when I started there in 2001, We were students together, and he's actually down at LSU, Louisiana State. He's been teaching trumpet and jazz there for a number of years. So he's the flugelhornist on that, the trio piece. And then the Reflections piece, I was very lucky to have 4 current Eastman faculty members play. Charles Pillow, who's an amazing New York-based multi-woodwind player, fantastic English hornist, and then Bob Snyder on guitar, who's taught at Eastman for a bunch of years, and then my mentor on drum set, Rich Thompson, and then the fantastic bassist, Jeff Campbell. So some Eastman connections for several, well, I guess for all of those pieces.
So let me just put in my 2 bits worth. First of all, everybody, this will go up on performingartsreview.net. Here's my pitch now. The video interview, how to buy the CD, of course, all that good stuff. My review will follow. I promise. I'm behind, but I'm catching up, I hope, with the will of Zeus and everybody else that can help me. But all up at performingartsreview.net. But my 2 bits worth are that this is an incredible CD. I'm not just saying it. It's amazing stuff. I continue to be amazed by all the incredible music that I'm listening to on CDs from wonderful musicians. And you have just described the level of performance. It's immaculate performance. And it kind of, I'm a little out of my kind of the order I wanted things, but this kind of leads me to ask a question, because I'm the classicist, and there is this 3rd stream. Yeah, I mean, this is Gunther Schuller, right? There's jazz, classic stuff. There is this 3rd stream. Chris, am I all wet or what?
Well, it's always difficult to pin down, the sources, because there's so many. And I mean, to tie back to our earlier part of the conversation, growing up with all this music around the house, we heard things from, opera to Van Halen, to jazz, and so all of these things come together in our music, and it really is difficult to say, whether it's a Gunther Schuller kind of thing. I don't know so much that, it's sort of our own individual take on all of these different influences. How we interpret those things, spin them out. And I always think of music that I compose as the music that I'd like to hear. So I try to take bits and pieces from, things, and then put them arrange them in a way that I enjoy hearing. And sometimes I'm more successful than others.
Okay, now Eric, do you want, because I want to ask Alan the same question, but in a different way. Eric, do you have any comment on that 3rd stream idea?
Yeah, I think that growing up in the household that we did, we were exposed to mother and father playing classical music. Those were their primary styles that they pursued, although my dad also played in a popular music band on electric guitar when he was a teenager and then into college. So we grew up listening to Beatles LPs. We listened to Peter, Paul, and Mary. But any given day, we might hear Motley Crue, followed by my dad playing a Bach transcription on guitar, followed by, I would listen to a Chicago album or something. And we all developed, all 4 of the kids developed, I think, in very different directions, which I think is fantastic. But one thing I would like to emphasize that I'm eternally grateful for is, although my parents would sometimes express that they thought that some of the music that we enjoyed was maybe not the best, they never forbade us from listening to anything. It didn't matter how atrocious it was. And I think that was really special, because we never got a feeling like, oh, I can't listen to that.
Alan, jump in, please, because
Okay.
if I been a parent, it would have been forbidden. That's how much of a straight edge square classicist I was. I thought it was garbage until recently. I'm mellowing. I'm getting older. Now I'm beginning to understand. Go ahead, Alan.
Okay, well, a couple of things that probably don't even sound terribly related to each other. First, I want to bounce back a little bit to our earlier talk about, I mentioned colleagues, and I need to say something certainly about a good friend, David Gomper, who is the composer at the University of Iowa, which is not Northern Iowa. Okay, University of Iowa is the big school, and that wonderful man wanted me to write a piece for his Center for New Music ensemble that just does new pieces, and that's what the hexachord fantasy is. And so that involves him conducting, and it was recorded down at the University of Iowa. So I just need to say, because that's kind of the largest ensemble that we have on there, and so thanks to him for that wonderful.
Thank you for remembering to bring him up. By the way, that is a conducted piece, so thank you.
Yes.
Now, how hard did you fight this thing with your kids playing all this crap?
So I grew up in the era of, and listening to Chet Atkins, the Beatles, Glenn Campbell.
See, you don't count. I mean, I'm obviously too old for you because I would never have tolerated you listening to that.
Oh, and just loved all that music. So I played guitar and had a little trio and a little group, and we would do, Antonio Carlos Jobim music and so on. So I was much into pop music when I was 18 years old. So what happened is, as I got into college, then I met the classical guitarist was Hector Garcia, the professor at the University of New Mexico back in the 60s and 70s. And that had a huge impact because then I learned to play classical and worked with him developing that. And so and kind of another thing that happened, and it's, again, popular music and so on. This whole thing about hexachords is to me a very fascinating thing. So my music, a lot of it is built with that. That's another way of saying, 12 tone, two hexachords that are a tritone apart. And I'm talking about the hexachord like Guido, which is just do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, just the first 6 notes of the major scale. And then you go a tritone away and you do the first 6 notes of that major scale, and you've hit all 12 pitches. That, I'm probably getting a little too technical, but that's played hugely into my music. And another kind of way or thing that happened is for several years I was involved in writing an opera about Martin Luther King. And that opera is based on spirituals, the black spirituals. And what I found in my research, again, I'm an academic, in the research, all the spirituals are based on the first 6 notes of the major scale. That is the melodies.
I've never heard that before. That's a revelation.
Yeah. If you just go through those, Let Us Break Bread Together, all these songs, they're made out of 6 note scales, major scales, and they just don't have the leading tone in the melody. But they do in the harmonies that if they choose to accompany. But, Let Us Break Bread Together, all these pieces, that's how they are. So that's influenced me, only I've kind of, if you will, twisted it around, turned it into 12-tone pieces. Not everything that I write is 12-tone, or is necessarily built off of hexachords.
Okay, you have to share. Christopher, please please answer the same question. The influences, the whys, the wherefores. Go.
Okay. It's hard to say that there's any particular one influence or even a few with my music again, but I tend to write music that's somewhat tonal, at least as a bouncing off point. And then there's kind of a free approach to harmony within a tone center. Again, I'm being kind of technical here, but it's sometimes
a lot of musicians watch this, so not to worry, we're fine so far.
Okay, I mean, there are definitely some jazz influences. Again, going back to having grown up listening to people like Herbie Hancock and Bill Evans, and the kinds of rich harmonies that they brought to their music. Some of that finds its way into my music, as well as music by Stravinsky or Ravel. So there are all these different things, and it's sort of like collecting little gemstones from each one and arranging them in different ways, than the original composers arranged them, and maybe coming up with something entirely different. But it's a very eclectic range from which I'm drawing. And I'll also say that, composition is, of course, a process, and you're constantly learning more about, you're becoming more sensitive to the music that you're trying to write. So I think of it, as I continue to develop, the lens is getting a little bit clearer with each piece that I write, to get me toward the sound I'm looking for, and, with each project. So, yeah, that's sort of, that's one way that I look at it.
Eric.
Okay. So
I love the way you say okay. Hang on, I got a cough. Excuse me. Sorry, go ahead.
So, out of the three of us on this CD, I probably do more jazz writing. That's kind of my area. Chris has actually won awards in jazz composition, so he's perfectly capable in that area as well. But I kind of stick more to jazz. I'm not as experienced in so-called classical music, whatever that means now. But I love Bach, especially his cello suites and his sonatas and partitas for solo violin and the four-part chorales. I ended up learning a little bit of that music when I was in high school, and during my undergraduate I did a degree in classical percussion performance, so I got to play some transcriptions on marimba, and that's been music that I return to constantly. I teach theory as well, so this semester actually I'm kind of torturing my students with Bach chorales and trying to get them to understand a little bit about how this stuff works from a compositional standpoint. And so I've got that. And you mentioned third stream music, and to me what's so interesting about jazz is it has always welcomed influences from everywhere. Even at its beginnings, it was taking melodies from opera, popular music of the day, and incorporating all of this with the blues and church music and brass bands and everything. So I find jazz, kind of with a capital J, to be a very welcoming, open language of expression. And I do love many so-called classical composers. The trio piece that's on the CD was inspired by Aaron Copland's Quiet City. This is kind of like a very condensed version of Quiet City. It's instead of trumpet, it's got flugelhorn, but it has the English horn, and then the entire chamber orchestra represented by the cello. But that's one of my favorite pieces of Copland's, and I love Stravinsky. Grew up with that a little bit, but bits and pieces here and there. I guess I look at music as the more you love in whatever style, genre, the better. It's like enjoying different types of food, and you can go to any restaurant and have a good meal. So I guess I don't look at it in terms of I want to do something ultra traditional, because I don't feel like that's where I could really be effective. But if I can incorporate some of what I love about Bach, along with some ideas of some more contemporary jazz composers, like Jim McNeely, who is a fantastic composer, pianist. He's been artistic director of the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra in New York City for a number of years. And his music was introduced to me at the University of Northern Iowa when I was doing an undergraduate degree there. And my mentor, Bob Washut, who retired last year, was absolutely inspiring. in that way. And Chris also got to study with him when he was doing a master's degree there. So, so we all have this connection to Northern Iowa as well. I did my bachelor's there. Chris did a master's there, and our dad taught there for over 2 decades. So, but that was a fantastic program. And again, Bob Washut is a real part of that legacy. He was there for almost 40 years, so he really was a force in that program. So just have to give a shout out to him.
Well, the reason I bring this up, and to my amazement, I bring it up at almost every interview that I'm doing, is you might have recognized by now that I have been a very straight-laced classical conductor, musician. All my life, I have had no use for the Beatles or any of that. All my life, I hated all that stuff. I thought it was a travesty upon our art and all that good stuff. So you see, have been very, very conservative. Of course, I've opened up big time now, and what astonishes me, remember, I've only really been, whatever, Performing Arts Review, maybe a couple years now, of receiving CDs from all over the place. I find over and over and over and over again in places I don't expect it. For example, German classical pianists of great, brilliant talent who are now freely improvising and doing jazz licks and all that. To me, it's like we may not all need to particularly credit Gunther Schuller, but you know what? He was prophetic, I think, from my experience. There is some kind of mix going on, especially among younger players. So I feel like the old man in the crowd for sure. Alan, I hope that makes you feel good. What have we? Let me see what I might have. What else I want to touch on here. We're going to have to wind it down. But what a great talk. We didn't really get to speak a lot about the music, so let me speak to it just a little bit. Just kind of an overview. Wonderful, wonderful repertoire. And I just want to make everybody aware that it's a broad and interesting range of instruments. The reflections, English horn, electric guitar. That's incredible, wonderful. The colors, bass and drums, fabulous, and jazzish. This is one of Eric's pieces. The trio for flugelhorn and English horn and cello, and now that you have told us, you said Quiet City, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I see that in my mind's ear, if you will. But of course, it's a beautiful, beautiful, unique and wonderful piece. Beautiful, beautiful colors. Big changes they had for tenor and bass trombone. That's something that trombonists need to pick up and learn and play all over the place. It's a beauty. Alan, the brass trio. You have confessed you're an academician. Academic. The brass trio is to my ear very, very academic. The hexachord fantasy is absolutely incredible. That is quite a chamber piece. I love it. And the tango fantasy is a beautiful business with the viola and guitar. What a great match. Let me just try and get through this. Sorry guys, I've got to wind it down. Christopher Schmitz. I think the 5 miniatures are a masterpiece. That is a beauty. That is a beauty of a piece. Rhapsody for violin and piano, just absolutely, that should be in the repertoire, period, for violin and piano. It's just gorgeous, and audiences would love it, so I hope it's being played more. The Playful Lark for flute and piano, and there are millions of flutists, that are going to get this. I hope they'll pay attention. But wonderful. All 3 of you, father and 2 kids. You did well, Alan. Apparently everybody's making halfway decent livings. I envy you all that. What else? Let's remind everybody. Excuse me. 2016 Ravello CD release. It's called Ace Composers 21st Century Chamber Music. And I'm going to put all of this up, including where to go to. Hang on, let me fix something here. Where to go to buy the CD and all that at performingartsreview.net. Thank you very much for it. Really, I hope, a wonderful interview that people are really going to enjoy watching. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.